Before this one begins, a small word from me. If you find your ear settling into these stories the way a hand settles onto a familiar railing, there is a longer companion I've been quietly building. A small collection of these tales, gathered and read the way I'd read them at a slow table, available now in audiobook form. It isn't loud about itself. It sits on the shelf the way an old lantern sits, patient, low-flamed, ready for the nights when sleep won't come and you'd rather have a voice in the room than the silence. You'll find the link in the description if you want it. If not, that's fine too. This is the story I have for you tonight. There are hollows in these old mountains where a door doesn't mean what a door means anywhere else. You can walk their ridgelines in high summer, and the county map will say a certain cabin sits back off the mule track by a quarter-mile, and the deed office in town will hand you a paper with a name on it and a boundary drawn in tidy ink, and you can go in there yourself with your own feet on your own two legs, and the cabin will not have a door. Not one. Not a plank hinge. Not a jamb. Not a threshold worn shallow by boots. And still, if you stand there long enough to let your breath slow, you'll know something inside is at home and expects to stay. Folks in the hollow don't approach those cabins anymore. They don't cross into their yard. They don't call from the road. There are places out here that the ground itself has decided about, and the people, being sensible, take their cue from the ground. And so, before I go any further, I want to hear from you. Where are you listening from tonight? Which hollow, which town, which back road, which apartment with the window open to nothing but the neighbor's hedge? Tell me. I read every one of them. It always surprises me how far this voice carries, and I'd like to know whose kitchen I'm in tonight, whose porch, whose long drive home. Leave a word below and I will find it. The old people in these hollows will tell you, if you sit at their table long enough, that not every wall wants a door in it, and not every room wants to be entered by the ordinary way that rooms are entered. There are places, they will say, that were built to be lived in from the inside without ever being left, and they were built that way on purpose, and it isn't wise to try and take a shortcut into the understanding of them. So we don't. We walk around. We take our cue from the ground. The winter of 1907 came in slow and mean across Cradock Hollow, up in the crooked western fold of the Blue Ridge, and in the second week of January of that year a man named Verlin Ashmore, Verlin, mid-40s, tall in a lean, loose-shouldered way, dark brown hair kept short under a felt hat, a thin scar along the ridge of his left brow from a saw kickback 10 years earlier, a walk that favored his left knee in the cold, came down the ridge road with a wagon and a borrowed mule to fetch his sister-in-law's cousin's boy from a farm 2 hollows over. Verlin had lost his wife Aletta 3 winters back, quick and hard, from a fever that had gone through the hollow and taken 4 before it moved on, and since then he had lived alone in a cabin his grandfather had built at the head of Cradock Creek. He had a habit of speaking to Aletta while he worked, quiet and unhurried, the way another man might hum. He was not lonely for the world. He was lonely for one particular person, and he had made peace with the difference. That is the man I want you to picture, coming down the road that January morning with a wool coat buttoned to his throat and a mule's breath steaming in front of him. Cradock Hollow ran east-west along a bend of the Tow River, 40 families or so, most of them third generation in place, tied together by cousinship or by an old debt of harvest labor. Cranesboro sat 6.5 miles down the ridge road with a depot, a store, a Methodist church, and a doctor who was drunk more often than not but who had never, in the memory of the hollow, been drunk when he was needed. They buried their own dead in a chinkstone graveyard behind the chapel, and every October the sexton, Otis Beam, 68, one-eyed from Cold Harbor, went through and reset the stones the frost had lifted. Otis was one of the few in the hollow who would speak of the Dovey cabin, and even Otis would only speak of it the way a man speaks of a bad tooth he cannot afford to pull briefly, and without looking you in the face. The boy he was fetching was called Asa Rush, 14, small for his age, hair the color of wet straw, a chip out of his front tooth from falling off a barn ladder the summer before, quiet in a way that some children are quiet because they have learned that grown people prefer it. Asa's mother had asked Verlin to keep the boy for a season while she went down to Asheville to sit with her own dying mother. Verlin had agreed without asking a fee and without making a show of the favor, because that was how his side of the family reckoned things. He met the boy at a gate, took the small bundle of clothes and the folded quilt, lifted him into the wagon seat, and turned the mule for home. Aletta had died on the 22nd of December, 1904, in the low bed by the west wall of their cabin, on the side that faced the door, because she had said in her last clear hour that she wanted to see who was coming in. He had washed her himself. He had let Mahalatakat braid her hair for the laying out. After the burial he had gone home and had not come out for 11 days, and when he came out on the 12th he was thinner and quieter, and the way he moved was slightly different. He still favored the west side of the bed. He still spoke to her while he worked, without embarrassment, and without expecting an answer, and it was, most days, enough. The road home ran along the creek and then bent up over a low shoulder of the ridge, and it was there, at the shoulder, that Asa first saw the other cabin. He pointed. He did not speak. Verlin, who had been on that road since before the boy was born, followed the small mittened finger and felt his stomach do a slow, uncertain turn, because the cabin Asa was pointing at should not have been visible from the road. It sat back 100 yards through a stand of yellow pine, tucked into a fold of ground the locals called Dovey's Bench after a woman who'd lived there in the 1860s, and the trees between the road and the cabin were thick enough that Verlin himself had ridden past it in every season of his life and never once seen more of it than a suggestion of gray wall through the trunks. But that morning the pines had been thinned by an ice storm the week before. Half of them snapped at the trunks, the rest leaned crazy, and there in the new gap sat the Dovey cabin, plain as a hand, and Asa was pointing at it because a thin thread of smoke was rising from its chimney. Verlin did not stop the wagon. He clicked to the mule and said, in the mild voice he used for children and animals, that the cabin had been empty since before he was born, and that the smoke was likely only fog off the creek catching the light, and he did not look at it again. But he knew fog, and the thread going up over the Dovey cabin was not fog. It was hearth smoke, thin and gray and steady, the smoke of a small careful fire kept for a long time, and Verlin Ashmore knew the difference between the two the way a man knows the difference between his own name and someone else's. Every child raised on those ridges was taught, in the quiet way children are taught not to put a bare hand into a snake hole in April, that the Dovey cabin on Dovey's Bench was not a place you went up to. The reason given, when a reason was given, was that a woman named Dovey Bramwell had lived there and died there in the 1860s, and that after she died the cabin had not sold and had not burned and had not fallen down and had not been claimed. That was the shape of the reason. The pines around it had grown up thick, generation by generation. Verlin Ashmore had lived his whole life inside that arrangement, and when the boy on his seat pointed through the new gap at a chimney smoke that ought not to have been there, he did not stop and did not turn his head for a second look, and did not say what he wanted to say, which was, "Not now, not this winter, not with a child on the seat next to me." At the cabin at the head of Craddock Creek, Verlin set the boy up in the loft with the quilt his mother had folded, showed him the water bucket and the chamber pot and the tin of dry biscuits, and went out to see to the mule. And while he was standing there with the mule's warm neck against his cheek, doing nothing in particular, he found himself thinking of Aletta and of what she would have said about the Dovey cabin having smoke coming out of it. Aletta had grown up in the hollow. Aletta had known the stories. Aletta had told him once, years ago, in the dark before sleep, that her grandmother had said the Dovey cabin was one of the ones you didn't approach in winter. That was all Aletta had ever said about it. She had not been a woman who talked around a thing. If she'd meant to tell him more, she would have. And she had not, and now she was gone, and there was no one in Craddock Hollow he was easy enough with to ask. There is a thing older women in the hollow used to say about certain pieces of ground. They used to say that ground keeps its own counsel. It was not a phrase people used lightly. Aletta had used it about Dovey's Bench exactly once on the night Verlin was remembering in the dark before sleep, and she had used it the way a person uses a word she means. He had not asked her more. He wished now that he had. You do not know when you have 26 years with a person that 26 years is going to be all you have with them, and you do not know until she is gone which of the small things you thought you had time to ask her about were the ones she had been waiting for you to ask. That first night, Asa slept in the loft, and Verlin sat by his own low fire and listened. He didn't know what he was listening for. He kept the door barred, which was not his habit, and he kept the shutters closed against a draft that wasn't there, and he told himself he was foolish, and he sat there anyway, listening to the creek run under the ice at the bottom of the yard. Sometime around what he judged to be the second hour past midnight, the dog started. He had not barred that door in 9 years. Not since the winter Aletta took sick. He had barred it on her last night out of ordinary care, and she had died before dawn, and he had never quite forgiven the door, or the plank, or himself. But that first night with the boy in the loft he had barred it, and he could not have said why, and he did not try to make himself say why, because he was old enough to know a man does not always have to know his reason is right. The dog was called Bit, an old brown collie mix with one white ear and a stiffness in the hind end from a horse having stepped on her when she was young. Bit had slept at the foot of Verlin's rope bed every night for 9 years. Bit did not howl. Bit did not bark, generally, at anything less than a bear at the smokehouse. That night, Bit rose from the hearth rug, walked to the barred door, and stood there looking at the wood of it as if she could see through it, and made a sound low in her throat that Verlin had never heard from her before. It was not a growl. It was closer to what a dog does at a coffin. He spoke her name. She did not turn her head. He got up, put his hand on her ruff. She was trembling. He stood there with her a long time and heard nothing outside. No step, no voice, no wind. And after a while Bit let out a breath and lay down again with her body pressed to the door and her eyes open and fixed on the boy's ladder. In the 9 years he had had her, Bit had barked twice at a bear and 3 times at a stranger and once at a copperhead in the woodpile, and that was the complete recorded history of her voice. She was a listening dog. So when she rose from the hearth rug and made that sound at the coffin, his whole body knew what it meant before his head did, and his head worked it out slowly, and did not want to have worked it out. That was the 4th of January. I want you to remember that date because from that night on, the calendar became a thing that mattered. The following morning, the 5th, Verlin walked the property line, as he did every winter after a hard freeze, checking his fence and his line blazes on the boundary oaks. He walked north along the ridge and then east down the shoulder and then south along the creek and then west back up through the pines, and it was on the pine leg of that walk, at a place he knew as well as the palm of his own hand, that he found the ground disturbed. A patch of forest floor about the size of a small quilt had been turned. Not dug. Turned. The pine needles that had been on top were folded under, and the older, blacker duff that had been beneath them was up on top now, arranged carefully, as if a hand the size of the whole patch had gone under it and lifted, and then set it back down inside out. There were no tracks around it. Not a boot mark. Not a hoof. Not the little tridents of turkey feet. And here is the part that made Verlin's mouth go dry. The patch was on a slope. It was on the uphill side of a small rise. And the loose duff on top was heaped slightly, as any hand-turned patch of ground would be, and the heap ran uphill. Uphill. Not downhill, the way soil settles when you disturb it on a slope. Uphill, against gravity, the way soil settles when you disturb it. Well, the way soil settles when nothing that walks on the earth in the ordinary manner has been near it. He had walked that boundary line every winter for 19 years, a walk he usually did without paying it much mind, the way a man walks his own hallway to the kitchen in the dark. That morning he walked it paying it mind. He walked it slow. You understand? The dirt was wrong. It wasn't scary in itself. It was just wrong. And Verlin Ashmore stood there in the pines with his hand on the trunk of an oak he had blazed with his own hatchet 19 years earlier, and he said aloud to no one, 7 doors for walls. He didn't know why he said it. He hadn't been thinking of a cabin. He hadn't been thinking of doors. The words came up out of him the way a hymn will, sometimes, when a man has stopped watching himself. 7 doors for walls. He shut his mouth around them and walked back down to his own cabin and did not tell the boy. He crouched at the edge of the patch. He did not touch it. It was not the disturbance of an animal. It was not the disturbance of a man with a shovel. It was the disturbance of something that had wanted the ground to look, from a certain angle, like it had been standing there. He rose with his knees popping and he walked home. Over the next 10 days the anomalies came at him in a way he could not later put into a straight order, though I will try to lay them for you as best the record allows. On the 6th of January, the well by the smokehouse threw up a rope of black hair when he drew it. Not a strand. A rope. Braided, wet, the length of his forearm, tied off at both ends. He burned it in the stove and did not speak of it. On the 7th, the ice on the creek at the foot of the yard cracked in a pattern that, when he stood over it, made the shape of a small 4-walled room, with 7 notches cut into the outline of the walls at even spacing, and he broke the ice with his heel until the shape was gone. On the 8th, Bit would no longer step past the woodpile toward the pines, and she began sleeping across the threshold of the boys' ladder rather than by the fire. The record I have of those 10 days is patchier than I would like. Verlin was not a writing man. What I have comes from 3 sources. Mahalatakit's account of what Verlin told her when he came to her table on the 10th. A set of small pencil dates Verlin scratched on the back page of an almanac his neighbor Elsie Rush kept after Verlin died. And 1 long letter Asa Rush wrote as a grown man in 1951 to a folklorist out of Chapel Hill. Between the 3, this is what I can tell you for certain. On the 9th, Asa woke up screaming and could not tell Verlin what he had dreamed. Only that someone had been standing in the loft counting. On the 10th of January, in the morning, Verlin went out to the pines again and the disturbed patch of ground had moved. It was 15 feet closer to his cabin than it had been the day before. There were still no tracks around it. The uphill heap was still uphill. But the small quilt of turned duff was 15 feet closer to his door, and he stood there in the cold and understood, without being told, that the thing was walking. That was when Verlin went to see the old woman. He did not want to go to her. He was, in the private center of himself, a proud man, and he did not want to be told he was in a trouble he could not by himself walk out of. But he had a boy in his cabin, and the boy was not his boy, and a responsibility for a child overrides the pride of a proud man in a hollow like this every time. So he went. Her name was Mahalatakit, and she was past 70, small, bird-like, hair gone iron gray and pinned in a knot the size of a walnut at the back of her head, blue eyes gone milky along the outer rim from cataracts, hands that trembled at rest and steadied to iron when they had work to do. She lived in a chinked log cabin on the other side of Craddock Ridge with her son Wiley, 49, wide-shouldered, slow of speech, kind in the way big slow men are sometimes kind. Mahala had midwifed Verlin's mother's last 3 children and had laid out a letter for burial with her own 2 hands, and she had never in Verlin's memory refused to answer a question a neighbor brought her, though she was known to answer some questions with silence, and to let a person understand that a silence, sometimes, was the answer. Verlin sat at her table and she poured him coffee out of a blue enamel pot and she waited. He told her about the smoke over Dovey's bench, and the dog at the door, and the turned patch of ground, and the well rope of hair, and the ice and the boy waking up. He did not tell her about the words that had come out of his mouth in the pines. He did not know why he held that one back. She listened without moving. When he was done, she set her cup down on the tin plate under it, and she looked past him at the wall. She said, when Dovey Bramwell was a young woman, she made a bargain. She was quiet a while. Her thumb moved on the rim of her cup. She said, my grandmother knew Dovey in the last years of her life, and was in the room the night she died. Dovey made her bargain when she was 19. She wanted a thing. The thing was not evil in itself, and I am not going to tell you what it was because that part is not for telling. She went somewhere in the ground up on the bench, somewhere the ground had a mouth in it in the 1830s, and she spoke into it and she was answered. She lived a long life after. And when she died, the ones who came to lay her out found that her body did not want to leave the cabin, and that the doors of the cabin would not stay open, and that every door the men set in a wall was found the next morning to be somewhere else in the wall, and then somewhere else again, and then in a wall that had no reason to have a door in it at all. So finally my grandmother's Uncle Amos, a wheelwright, calm and unspookable, boarded every one of the doors up on the outside with sawn pine plank, and painted the planks with pine tar so no seam showed, and said, well, if the cabin wants to keep its own doors, let the cabin keep its own doors, and we will not go into it again. She said, I am not going to tell you what for or with what because the not telling is on purpose. Some of these stories, the telling is the mouth of them, and if you tell it, it takes you. My grandmother knew the whole of Dovey's bargain and she died with it in her, and I know some of it and I will die with what I know in me, and my son will know less than I do, which is how it should be. But I will tell you this much, Verlin Ashmore. Dovey Bramwell lived in that cabin. She made a bargain. The bargain came due. And when it came due, they built her a place to stay. She said, 7 doors. For walls. She said it as if reading it off a page. And Verlin felt the hair on the back of his neck rise the way a horse's hide will ripple in one long shudder. He said, how did you? She said, hush. She said that cabin was built to hold her. Doors that don't open on any wall a hand can find. Doors that open only when she looks at them. She keeps her own house. She does not leave it ordinarily. The pines around it grow up thick to help. But every so many winters, When the pines fail, the ground remembers. And the ground moves toward the nearest hearth that has a child in it. She looked at him then, milky blue eyes gone hard as glass. She said, "You have a child in your cabin, Verlin." He said, "He is not mine." She said, "The ground does not care whose. The ground counts breath." He asked her what to do. She was quiet for a long time. She said, "Take the boy off the ridge. Take him tonight. Not in the morning. Tonight. Go down to Cranesboro and put him on the train and send him to his mother. Do not come back to your cabin for the burning." She said, "And hear me now, because I am going to say this once, and I am not going to say it again, and I am not going to answer questions about it. That cabin will not tolerate a child in a hearth-warmed cabin within a mile of it any longer than it takes the ground to close the distance. It closes the distance the way it closed the distance on the Callicott's oldest in 1891, and it closed the distance on the little Ashmore girl in 1876 before you were born, and it has closed the distance every third or fourth winter since Dovey was laid in it, and every one of the times we let it close the distance we lost a child. And I have been quiet a long time about the ones we lost. I have been quiet because the quiet was what my grandmother taught me, and because the burning in 1891 did not go through, because the men lost their nerve at the last, and Ephraim Callicott lost his boy the following April, and I said to myself then, one more time, and then, and this is that then. So it will go tonight, Verlin. It should have gone in 1891. It will go tonight. He said, "The burning." She said, "That cabin has to go." It should have gone in 1891 when the last of the Bramwells died, and it didn't, because the men who tried to burn it lost their nerve, and one of them lost his boy the following spring. It has to go now before it comes any closer. Wiley and me and the 2 Callicott brothers, we will do it. You get the child gone. He said, "And me? Where do I go?" She said, "That's between you and what you owe the child. But do not sleep in that cabin tonight. Do not sleep in it again." He left her table and walked back over the ridge in the low afternoon light, and everything in him was cold in a way the January air couldn't account for. The Dovey cabin sat in its gap of pines with a thread of smoke rising, and as he passed the shoulder of the road he made himself look at it, and he could have sworn, that a small pale shape moved past one of the front windows. A window, on a cabin without a door. He came around the shoulder of the road at the bench, and he made himself look at the cabin. 50 yards, maybe, behind the wavy old glass of the small square window there was, for the span of one breath, a pale shape that moved from left to right, at the speed of an unhurried person crossing a small room. It did not stop. It did not look out. It was not a face exactly. He would only later use the word shape. And the window was empty again, and Verlin walked the last quarter-mile home with his heart beating in his throat and did not turn around. Let's go back to the story. Have you ever known, in your body, before your mind had words for it, that a thing was wrong? That the room you just walked into wasn't quite the same room you'd walked into 1,000 times before? Though nothing in it had moved, nothing had changed, and no one had been there to change it? If you have, you know what Verlin Ashmore felt walking down the ridge road that afternoon. His feet knew it before his head. His feet wanted to be somewhere else, wanted to be anywhere else, and he had to make them walk him home. And when he got home, the plan he had made, the good, careful plan of packing the boy up, of feeding the mule, of harnessing the wagon by lantern light, of driving down to Cranesboro at first dark and putting Asa on the last train south. That plan did not survive the next hour, because at the next hour everything got worse than he had prepared for, and he had to move by night, and by night is not how a man in this hollow chooses to move if he has any choice at all. I want you to sit with that for a moment, because most of what happens after this happens because Verlin did not get the daylight he thought he had. At home, he set Asa to packing his small bundle. He told the boy his mother had sent word that she needed him earlier than expected, which was a small kind lie. He fed the mule an extra measure of oats. He was tying the last strap on the harness at a little past 4 in the afternoon when Bit, standing in the open door of the barn, went stiff from her tail to her ears and made that sound again, the sound at the coffin, and Verlin turned and looked up toward the pines above his cabin and saw the patch of turned ground come out of the treeline. He had thought, on the walk home, that he had until full dark. He had thought he had 2 hours, at least, of usable January afternoon in which to do things in the proper daylight order. Feed the mule, harness the wagon, pack the boy's small bundle a second time and check that his mother's letter was folded into the inside pocket of his coat. bar the smokehouse against the raccoons even though the peg was not going to hold, set out a lantern by the front step, and drive down the ridge road at first dusk with the last of the pale light on his back and the wagon lantern out in front of him. That was the plan. It was a good plan. It was the plan a careful man makes for a bad afternoon. And I want you to understand, because understanding this is understanding most of the difference between how a story like this ends well and how it ends badly, that plans of that kind in a hollow like this are almost never permitted to unfold at their own pace. Something in the ground, or in the pines, or in whatever it is that keeps count in a place like Dovey's Bench, does not want a careful man to have his careful afternoon. Something in the ground of Dovey's Bench had been counting since the 4th of January, and by the 10th, the count was up. It was not walking. That is not the right word. But it was moving. It was crossing the open pasture between the pines and his kitchen garden at the pace of a slow man's stride, and no snow was disturbed at its edges, and no track was laid behind it, and the uphill heap in the middle of it moved uphill against a slope that shouldn't have been a slope at all, because the pasture was flat. It was making its own uphill as it came. Wherever the front edge of it was going was uphill from wherever the back edge of it had been, and it was coming toward the cabin door. Verlin did the only thing a man does in that moment. He shouted the boy's name. You have to imagine the light. Late afternoon January in the Blue Ridge. The sun already down behind the west ridge, but the sky still holding a thin cold gray. Colors going out of the world one by one. Only the shapes remaining. And you have to imagine the sound. There was no sound. That was the worst of it. Not the wind in the pines. Not the creek under its ice. Not a crow. Not a stove crackle from the chimney. Everything the yard normally made gone. And in the silence, a small clear voice, coming from up on Dovey's Bench, began to count. 1, 2, 3, in the exact patient tone of a woman counting sheets into a linen chest. Asa came out of the loft and down the ladder in socks, and Verlin threw him bodily onto the wagon seat and threw the mule's lead into his hands and told him to go, to drive, to not stop, to keep going down the road to town no matter what he heard behind him. And Asa's small chip-toothed face went white and did not cry, and clicked to the mule the way Verlin had taught him, and the wagon went. Verlin stood in the yard with an axe he had grabbed off the woodpile and watched the wagon go, and watched the patch of turned earth cross the last 20 feet of pasture, and heard, from the direction of Dovey's Bench, a small clear voice count. 1, 2, 3. I am not going to tell you exactly what happened in the yard. Mahala had said, some of these, the telling is the mouth of them. I will tell you what the record allows. I will tell you what a careful, sober-minded folklorist could put on a page and defend. I will tell you that in Verlin's own scratched penciled words on the back page of his almanac, written that night or the following morning, in a hand shakier than his usual hand, are the words, "It came to the fence and it did not cross." And under that, in the same hand, it did not cross because Bit stood in the gap. And under that, Bit was between it and the door, and I do not know why that mattered, but it mattered. And that is all he wrote of the encounter itself. He was not a man to embroider. He was not a man to guess. I will tell you that Bit stayed. Verlin tried to send her after the wagon. She would not go. She placed herself between the door of the cabin and the patch of ground, and she showed her teeth for the first time in her 9 years with him. I will tell you that Verlin lived. That the axe was not what saved him. That what saved him was Mahala Tackett coming up the road at a run, small, 70-odd, iron in her spine, with Wiley behind her and the Callicott brothers behind Wiley, and every one of them carrying a 5-gallon can of kerosene from the store in Cranesboro. Mahala did not go to Verlin. Mahala went past him, past the patch on the ground, up through the pines, straight to the Dovey cabin, and while the men uncapped the cans, she stood in front of that doorless wall and she spoke to it. She spoke for a full minute. No one has ever asked what she said. She would not have told them if they had. When she was done, she stepped back and Wiley put a match to the kerosene and the cabin went up like a dry rick, with a sound like a long, slow exhale, and the small pale shape at the window did not come out. The patch of turned earth in Verlin's yard was gone in the time it took to walk down from the bench. Simply gone. As if a page had been lifted. There were no tracks where it had been. Bit lay down in the middle of where it had been and put her nose on her paws and would not move for 6 hours. Verlin sat on the step of his own cabin and did not weep, exactly, but the sound that came out of him for a long time was not the sound a whole man makes. There is a small detail in Elsie Rush's account that I want you to hear, because it is the sort of detail a man does not invent. Elsie said that when the four of them came back down from the bench in the last of the dusk, Mahala's hair, which had been pinned in the walnut-sized knot at the back of her head when she went up, was unpinned when she came down, and hung loose over her shawl, iron gray, long past her waist. None of the three men behind her asked about it. She never pinned it up again, so far as Elsie ever knew, for the rest of her life. Elsie thought this meant something. He was never sure what. The record, after that, has a quiet stretch to it, and I want to walk you slowly through it because most of what matters about the story sits in the quiet. Asa Rush made Cranesboro on the mule and wagon by lantern light and slept that night in the room above the general store and was on the 7 a.m. train south to his mother the next morning. He grew up. He became a schoolteacher in a small town in the Piedmont. He married. He had 3 daughters. He did not speak of Craddock Hollow except once to his oldest daughter, when she was 13 and asked why her father would never let her sleep in a room above a loft. He said only, "When I was your age I stayed with a good man in a cabin in the mountains, and something outside counted us at night, and I have never wanted to be counted again." She did not ask him to say more. He died at 71 in 1964 in his own bed with his daughters around him, and the last thing he said, so quietly they had to lean in for it, was 7, for his oldest daughter did not know what it meant. She kept it anyway. There is a piece of Asa's 1951 letter to a Chapel Hill folklorist that I want to read to you. He wrote, "I do not remember the whole of the road down. I remember the mule's ears in front of me, black against the last of the gray sky. I remember my hands on the reins, and that my hands were the coldest they had ever been in my life. I remember that behind me, once, I heard a sound I cannot describe, that I did not turn my head for, because Mr. Ashmore had told me not to turn my head. I remember that the storekeeper in Cranesboro looked at me for a long moment when I came into the store, and did not ask me a single question, and put me in the room over the store to sleep, and sat outside my door in a chair with a shotgun across his knees, and I did not learn until years later that he had sat there through the night. I do not know what he was expecting, but he sat. Mahala Tackett lived another 11 years. She never spoke of the Dovey cabin again, not to Verlin, not to Wiley, not to anyone. Wiley Tackett kept a small pouch of ash from the burning in a drawer by his bed for the rest of his life, and when he died in 1931, his wife found the pouch and did not know what it was and buried it with him without opening it, which was, one hopes, the right thing to have done. The 2 Callicott brothers, Ephraim and Josiah, both drowned within a year of each other in the Tow River in the summer of 1914, and no one in the hollow ever quite said out loud that the 2 things were connected, though the ones who had been alive in 1907 looked at each other at the funerals in a certain way, and the ones who hadn't been alive then knew from the look that something was being carried and not passed on. Verlin Ashmore stayed in his cabin at the head of Craddock Creek. He did not remarry. He kept Bit until she died of old age in the autumn of 1913, and after Bit was gone he kept 2 more dogs after her, and neither of them, according to the neighbors, ever slept on the hearthrug. They both slept across the base of the loft ladder, the way Bit had, even though there was no child in the cabin, and Verlin, when asked, said he did not know why. He worked his land. He mended fence. He walked to church in Cranesboro once a month and sat in the back pew and did not sing. And every night, before he barred his door, he stepped out onto his porch and looked up toward Dovey's bench, where the pines had grown back thick and where no cabin sat anymore, and he said aloud the same short thing. 7 doors. For walls. The neighbors heard him. At it sometimes, coming down the ridge road on their own business, and they did not ask him about it, and he did not offer. He did it every night, without fail, for the next 31 years until the winter of 1938, when he died in his sleep at 76, and his neighbor Elsie Rush, a distant cousin of Ace's who had come to sit with him toward the end, swore, to the day of his own death, that on the night Verlin passed, at the exact hour of it, a small pale shape crossed the pasture between the pines and the cabin, at the pace of a slow man's stride, and stopped at the door and stood there a while and went back. There is more, and I will tell it because you deserve the rest. In the summer of 1922, a land company out of Knoxville came into Craddock Hollow and tried to buy Dovey's Bench for a hunting lodge. The company was called Kentwood Land and Timber, incorporated in Tennessee. Verlin, who owned the adjoining acre, went with the company's man to the county deed office in Cranesboro to walk the boundary on paper. The clerk at the deed office was a young woman named Effie Cordell, 23, dark hair pinned up, a slight limp from childhood polio, sharp as a needle at her work, and she pulled every deed and every record for Dovey's Bench going back to 1862, and she found that Dovey Bramwell had lived and died there, and that the parcel had passed through 3 hands after, and that the last recorded transfer was in 1890, and that thereafter the parcel had no owner of record, no tax paid, no transfer, no probate, and no note anywhere that a cabin had ever burned on it, though 4 men and 1 old woman in the hollow could describe the fire in exact detail. That was strange enough. But this is what Effie Cordell wrote in her own hand in a note in the margin of the file, which is still in the Cranesboro courthouse basement to this day, if you know how to ask for it. I wrote to Kentwood Land and Timber in Knoxville to confirm their interest. The letter came back unopened. The postmaster said there is no such company. I asked their man for his card again. He had no card. He gave a name that is not in any city directory I can find. He was polite and he left. That's all. The man from Kentwood was slight, well-dressed for a hollow errand, in a dark broadcloth suit cut by a city tailor, with a face that was, as Effie Cordell put it in her later note, difficult to hold in the mind after he had left the room. She wrote, I could not recall the color of his eyes. I could not recall the sound of his voice, though he had spoken to me for the better part of half an hour. I recall only that his hands were folded on his hat, that his shoes were very well polished, and that when I asked him to spell his own name for the ledger, he spelled it twice, and each time he spelled it a slightly different way and did not seem to notice. The company's man was never seen in the hollow again. No hunting lodge was built. The land, on paper, still belongs to no one. The pines on the ground have grown back thick. And people in Craddock Hollow to this day, because this is a story that has an any more in it, not just a once, do not walk up onto Dovey's Bench. They do not send children that way for berries in July. They do not run dogs through it in October. If you ask them why, most of them would say it's just a bad piece of ground and shrug and change the subject. If you ask the older ones, they might, if you sat long enough at their table, tell you that the ground up there has a way of moving uphill on you when it shouldn't. And if you ask the oldest of them, the ones with grandmothers who remembered, well, they wouldn't answer. They would just look at their coffee. And you would understand. There is one more thing, and then I will stop. Every year, on the 10th of January, the date of the day the ground came out of the pines, Verlin Ashmore, for the 31 years of his life that remained, walked up the ridge road at first light with a small tin cup of milk and a folded square of clean linen. He set the cup on the ground at the edge of where Dovey's Bench meets the road. He set the linen beside it. He said nothing. He turned around and walked home. The cup and the linen were always gone by the following morning. No animal had ever left tracks in the snow around them. No print. No brush of a tail. Nothing. In the year after Verlin died, Elsie Rush kept up the practice, and in the year after Elsie died, his son kept it, and the son's son after him, and if you drive up the old ridge road in Craddock Hollow on the 10th of January, in the early cold light, and you look at the shoulder of the road at the edge of Dovey's Bench, you will still see a small tin cup and a small folded square of linen. It is set there each year by a man named Corliss Rush, who is Elsie's grandson and who is 68 and who has done it every January since he was a boy of 9, and who could not, if you sat him down and asked, say exactly why. He would only tell you that his grandfather taught him, and that his grandfather's father was on a train south when he was 14, and that in his family they don't skip. The milk was fresh milk from a specific cow. Verlin kept a heifer for the sole purpose of that 10th of January, and when the heifer aged out he kept another. Elsie took the practice over in 1938, and kept his own heifer for the same reason, and Elsie's son after him and Corliss after him. Corliss has a small Jersey now, a 2-year-old named Bethel. He has told me the one time I asked that he does not know exactly why the milk has to be from a particular animal kept for a particular reason, but that he knows it does, and that the not knowing exactly is part of the practice. I have been up to Dovey's Bench myself once in daylight in the middle of summer, and I will tell you plainly that the pines grow thicker there than they grow on any adjoining ridge, and that a compass in that stand does something a compass shouldn't do, and that I left before I had meant to. I do not stay long in places that expect a small careful cup at their edge in January. I take my cue from the ground, as the ones before me took theirs. I say that plainly because the practice is a live practice still. This is a folklore story with a small tin cup set on the shoulder of a specific road on a specific date, this year by a living man because Mahalatakit told Verlin Ashmore, in the January of 1907, that the leaving of the cup was a courtesy. And no one in Cradock Hollow is willing to find out what happens if the courtesy is one day not paid. There's a story I've been keeping for another night. A Missouri hollow, a well that a man dug and then guarded past the point of reason, and a summer when the water in it began sounding closer than water sounds. And if you'll come back for that one, I will tell it slowly, the way this one deserved to be told. And if you know a story yourself, from your own hollow or your own back road or the place your grandmother wouldn't talk about, leave it in the comments below. I read them all. Some of them find their way in time into the next tale I tell. This one, tonight, I first heard from a woman in a diner in Cranesboro who did not want her name used. I have tried to be worthy of her trust in the telling. So before I let you go, if you have known in your body before your mind had words for it, that a place was concealing something quietly, deeply wrong that the world would not agree to explain, tell me. Tell me what you did about it. Tell me if you were the one who left the cup, or the one who took the child down the road, or the one who came up the hill with the kerosene, or the one who stood at the doorless wall and spoke for a minute to whatever was inside. Tell me which of those you would be, because I think most of us find out eventually which of those we are. Mind the low ground. Mind the doors you can't find. And whatever you do, count your own breath before you sleep, and do not let anything outside your window do the counting for you.